In the last video, we did a little bit of troubleshooting around the current version of NPM. Now again, you may or may not have had that little issue. Either way, at this point in time, you should be able to go back to the server directory, run the npm run dev command, and then see both the backend server and the front end server both pop up. So at this point, I am able to go back over to my browser at localhost 3000 and see the message, "Hi there." And remember, "Hi there" is being generated by our app component at this point in time. So let's continue with our setup. Again, at this point, we have our index.js file, which is going to be housing a little bit of our Redux setup. And then we also have the app.js file, which will eventually hold some of the React router stuff. Let's continue inside the index.js file at this point in time and continue on with some of the setup around the Redux side of our application. Now in this video, we're not only going to do some of the actual setup, but we're also going to talk about some of the different libraries that we're using, specifically the React Redux library, which is one that we installed in like 2 videos previous. We're going to do a little bit of a discussion about how we wire up Redux from scratch, and then we will actually add it to this file. So let's get to it. All right, I'm going to pull up a diagram. And here we go. Okay. So remember, we have at this point installed React, Redux, and React Redux. As a reminder, the Redux library is all about holding all the state or all the data inside of our application. And so it's fairly easy for us to kind of make a guess on some of the different pieces of state we'll have inside of our application. I kind of expect to eventually have probably 2 separate reducers inside of our application, or 2 separate pieces of state, one of which will be essentially in charge of just deciding whether or not the user is logged in. And then the other will be responsible for recording a list of all the surveys or fetching a list of all the surveys that the user has created over time. Now we might end up with another reducer or 2 inside of our application, but we'll just see how it all pans out and then go from there. For right now, I think that this is a pretty good place to start with and kind of to aim towards. So as a reminder of how Redux works behind the scenes, at the very top we've got our Redux store, which is where all of our state exists. To determine our current state, or to change our state, we call an action creator, which dispatches an action. The action is sent to all the different reducers inside of our application. Those reducers are combined together with the combine reducers call, and that is used to update the state in our Redux store. Put another way, we can look at this diagram right here. So again, a little bit of a reminder of what Redux is doing for us. We have a React component. From the React component, we will call an action creator that will return an action that will be sent to all of our different reducers, which will then update all of the state inside of our Redux store. After that update, all of that state that exists inside the store will be sent back down to our React components, which causes them to re-render and display some amount of new content on the screen. So let's get to setting this thing up. Before we actually wire in or import any libraries into the index.js file, I want to talk a little bit about this very root level setup of Redux, because I've never really gone through it in any of my other courses in great detail, and so I want to take just a little bit of time and expand upon the exact setup we're going to do inside this file. So at this point, we've just reviewed and said, yes, we've got this store, it contains all of our state, and somehow it connects up to the React side of our application so we can update the state that exists inside of it. But how does that actually connect to React per se? Like, what setup are we really doing here? Okay, so this is what really goes on behind the scenes. Inside of our index.js file, we are going to create our Redux store, and we are also going to render a provider tag. The provider tag right here is a React component that is provided to us by the React Redux library. And remember, the React Redux library is a library whose sole purpose is to make sure that React and Redux work together nicely. So that provider tag, you can really think as being the sort of bonding layer or the kind of glue that exists between the React and Redux sides of our application. So we will provide that provider tag. We will pass it our Redux store. Because the provider tag is at the very parent component of our application, any other component that we create, like say something called a survey list item, can reach directly into the Redux store and pull out some amount of state solely thanks to that provider tag. So it is really this provider tag that we're going to place that serves as the sort of glue between the React and Redux sides of our application. Now I might have one other diagram here. No, I don't think I do. Okay, so this is a good one. So just as another example here, the entire purpose of that store at the very top of our application is to give us the ability to access data inside of our application from a very deeply nested component. And so we don't have any of these post list things over here, any of these post list components or anything like that. I just mean to remind you that if we have a very heavy component hierarchy or a lot of components inside of our application, part of the idea behind Redux is that some arbitrary component all the way down here can access the global data or global state inside of our application by reaching directly into that Redux store. Okay? So with that in mind, just very quick review, kind of high level stuff, and what the purpose of that provider tag is. Let's now import the provider tag. We'll import some helpers from Redux, and we'll get started with setting up the Redux side of the application. So at the top of our index.js file, I'm going to import the provider tag from React Redux. I'll import the create store and apply middleware helpers from Redux. Right underneath our import of the app component, we will use the create store helper to create a new instance of our Redux store. So right here around line 8 or so, we'll say const store is create store. Now the first argument to create store is all the different reducers that we have inside of our application. Now we haven't set up any reducers just yet, so I will give it a single dummy reducer. Okay, a single dummy reducer. We're going to replace this very shortly. So my dummy reducer is going to be an arrow function that returns an array, like so. So again, we're going to come back and replace this argument right here. This is just a stand-in to make sure that we can at least get Redux started up. As a second argument, I'll provide the starting or initial state of my application. This second argument right here is most relevant when you're taking care of server-side rendering and stuff like that. So for us, we don't really care about setting up some type of initial state. So we're going to just pass in an empty object. Then finally, we will add in the apply middleware call right here. We don't have any middleware that we're going to hook up right away, but we will come back very shortly and add Redux Thunk in here. So I will add in apply middleware like so, and I'll make sure that I invoke it by placing a set of parentheses. Okay, so that looks good to start. We're now going to expand upon this app component right here. Remember, we had just said that at the very top level of our application, so up here at the very top, right above the app component, I want to show the provider tag, or this provider component that is provided to us by the React Redux library. So inside the index.js file, we're going to place that provider tag, and as an immediate child right inside of it, we'll place the app component. Now, all these words might seem kind of complex. In practice, what we're going to do here is fairly straightforward. So first, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space to work with, like so. I'm then going to remove the first argument entirely, and we're going to put the app back in here, but I just want to do it from scratch. So I'm going to say, here's my provider tag. I'm going to make sure I put a comma after it, because this is the first argument, and the document query selector is a second. To the provider, I'm going to pass the store that we just created as a prop. So store is store, like so. And then as a child to the provider tag, we'll pass the app component, like so. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. So we now are still showing the app component, but we have also created a Redux store at the very top level of our application and hooked it up to the React side of our application by placing the provider tag. Again, remember, the provider tag right here, it is a React component that knows how to read changes from our Redux store. Anytime the Redux store gets some new state produced inside of it, the provider will inform all of its children components, so essentially everything that the app renders, that some new state is available, and it will update all of those different components with the new state. So this is looking pretty good. Let's flip on over to our browser and just make sure everything is still appearing on the screen without any errors. So if I go back to localhost 3000, it looks like the automatic refresh has already kicked in, so I think we're good to go here. Let's refresh once just to really make sure. Okay, so here's my refresh. And I still see hi there appear on the screen. Okay, so this is a pretty good start. Let's continue in the next section. We're going to start to expand out on the different reducers inside of our application. Remember, we just spoke about how we'll probably have like an auth reducer and a surveys reducer. So we'll review that stuff a little bit, and then we'll set up some different reducers and make sure we provide them as the first argument to create store rather than this kind of dummy reduce here. So I'll see you in the next section.